Okay, welcome everyone. We are so very excited for our Ethics Cafe. This is a quarterly series that we have started in order to help people meet their ethical training for their professional development requirements. This is in honor of February, an African-centered ethical practice ethics cafe. So it can also meet your requirements around anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice, or just general professional development. We are so incredibly excited to have Dr. Chike Jeffers and Dr. Marika Warren, who are here, both from Dalhousie. And I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. I would like to ask everyone to join with me in the chat. This is a webinar, so you have actually two options, either the chat or Q&A. But please put in the chat the name of where you are located. If you don't know the Mi'kmaq name, or if you're joining us from outside of Mi'kma'ki, you can Google it. One website that's really good is placenames.mapdev.ca. And what's great about this one is it also has a little thing that can teach you how to pronounce where you're located. So please join with me in acknowledging the location where you are. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Wasakusikuam, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all the wise Mi'kmaq elders and Ilnu community leaders who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this work. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways that colonization and racism fills our world. Let us take this moment to commit to justice and healing. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all human beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here, as well as an expression of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we all must begin to learn and honor. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. Wulali. Thank you all. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing. And I am super excited to introduce Dr. Chike Jeffers so that we can all begin to learn from him. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I will briefly share my screen to draw your attention to a podcast that I'm involved in. This is the website historyofphilosophy.net, the website where you can find this podcast. There's a larger podcast called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, but then specifically within it, I co-write the episodes on Africana philosophy, right? On philosophy from Africa and the African diaspora. And I'd like to highlight in particular among the episodes of this podcast, this one right here, I Am Because We Are, Communalism in African Ethics and Politics. And I will share the link actually in the chat. Also, for those who are interested in subscribing to the podcast, if you use whatever podcast supporting app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever, if you search for History of Indian and Africana Philosophy, then you'll find it that way. Because yes, the episodes on Africana philosophy are in the same feed as some episodes he did on the history of philosophy in India. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and begin to say a few things about ethical practice as it is understood in traditional African cultures. So the title, as you will have noticed, I Am Because We Are, the title of that episode is drawn from a book by John Mbiti called African Religions and Philosophy. And he intended the phrase to be sort of a twist on Rene Descartes' famous phrase, I think, therefore I am, right? And so if I think, therefore I am is this very famous phrase in philosophy, and there's a lot to be said about what it means, but about what Descartes meant by it. But one thing that you'll notice is that, I think, therefore I am, is a statement that centers oneself as an individual, right? And then you'll notice that John Mbiti's phrase, that through which he's attempting to capture what's important to traditional African ethics, is I am because we are, right? So the contextualization of the individual in the context of the group, right? And not just the recontextualization of the individual, but the clear indication that the individual exists only because the group exists. The individual has whatever identity the individual has because of the group. And so here's another quotation from Mbiti. Whatever happens to the individual happens to the whole group, and whatever happens to the whole group happens to the individual. The individual can only say, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. Right? And so that's an interesting statement, right? There are ways in which BT grounds that idea in the existence of various rituals of incorporation, right? Things like rites of passage, and even things like marriage rites, various ways, various customs that suggest that the individual has reached a new stage of life in a way that acknowledges and emphasizes the individual's connection to the larger community. Okay, so another phrase that is important in the study of African ethics. There's a phrase in the Zulu language, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. And what that means is a person is a person through other people, right? And this, as you can tell, is already similar to this idea of I am because we are, right? But this phrase, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, a person is a person through other people, is associated also with a term that some of you may have even heard of, Ubuntu, right? UBUNTU. And so it's in Zulu and certain other languages of Southern Africa. And in fact, I once worked with a student on the student was from Zimbabwe, right? And we worked on the idea of Ubuntu, but we were calling it Hunu, HUNHU, because the Shona people of Zimbabwe, they have a term that is similar and even I think etymologically related, right? Because of the relationship between the Bantu languages of that region. These Southern African cultures tend to have a term that is equivalent to Ubuntu if they don't use Ubuntu themselves, right? And this is a term that has been made famous even by people like Bishop Desmond Tutu, in terms of the struggle in South Africa against racism and his idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as showing Ubuntu, right? Which, is interesting, but even controversial, right? In terms of how we think of things like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and what they mean for justice. Okay, so there's a couple more phrases that I want to put out there before I pass things over. Because there are some interesting proverbs that Kwame Gyekye, a Ghanaian philosopher, some proverbs that he used to examine communalism in traditional African thought, and also what he thought were the important limitations on communalism in traditional African thought. So on the one hand, from his ethnic group, the Akan of Ghana, and also some neighboring countries to Ghana. One proverb that he took from that tradition is, when a man descends from heaven, he descends into a human society, right? And there again, we have something that we can relate to I am because we are, or a person is a person through other people, right? This foundational emphasis on an individual not being able to understand themselves except through their relationships with other people, right? But then on the other hand, Gyekye quotes another proverb that says, the clan is like a cluster of trees, which when seen from afar appear huddled together, but which would be seen to stand individually when closely approached. What's interesting about that proverb is that it seems to suggest that we shouldn't let communal connections, right, mislead us into forgetting about the fact that we are in important ways also distinct and separate individuals, right? So according to Gyekye, it's important not only to see how traditional African thought, as expressed in something like Proverbs, showed, an emphasis on a communal ethic, a communal sense of one's identity. Yes, it showed that, but also he feels it's important that there was an emphasis as well on how we are distinct individuals. And the last point I'll make is that there's an art motif in the Akan tradition, where there's a Siamese crocodile, right? A crocodile with two heads joined to a single body, right? And this symbol relates to a proverb that speaks of two heads fighting over food, even though they have one stomach, right? And when Jeche brings this proverb and that art motif up, he brings it up to say that we have here a balance between understanding the communal point, right? The common stomach of the crocodile represents the common good, the fact that we are members of a community and harmoniously cooperating is in our best interests and is how we best express ourselves as humans. But he thinks also that the two heads is an acknowledgement of individuality and the fact that we can have different interests and tastes and leanings and orientations and so on. And if these divergences can sometimes lead to conflict, the hope is that by recognizing both our divergences, both our individuality and also our common good, the common stomach, again, in the crocodile example, the hope is that will allow us to properly balance the communal and the individual aspects of who we are.
Thank you so much. What an amazing start to our Ethics Cafe, and so grateful for that. I'm going to keep that image forever. The two heads and one stomach is a very powerful visual. And how do we balance the individual with the common good is certainly the raw material of many ethical decision challenges that we face collectively and individually. So for all of our members who are joining us, the goal of these series is to help us think about ethical decision making within ourselves as a profession, social work, and then within our roles in the larger context. And Dr. Jeffers really helped to contextualize the larger context. And I have 5 million questions, as I'm sure you all do. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. We'll get to them after. But one of the things that we're really excited about is Dr. Marika Warren is going to be joining us in a few seconds, and I'm adding her right here now. Dr. Warren oversees ethics across our health systems here in Mi'kma'ki. And what is important for us to understand is sometimes when people have ethical concerns as social workers, it relates to their job, their profession. What should I be doing as a social worker, and our code of ethics? And mental note, our code of ethics is in the process of changing to be much more explicitly anti-racist and more explicitly collectivist, as opposed to the individualistic Eurocentric approach that has guided much of academic philosophy and many of the so-called helping professions. But sometimes you may be observing an ethical conflict that is not related to being a social worker, but is related to the systems within which you work, which are, of course, colonial systems reflective of larger racist principles. And you might be seeing that the common good is not being addressed. So in those situations, it's really important for social workers not to feel isolated or alone, that we have resources to whom we can draw, and actually ethics committees are sources of advocacy. So with that, I'm going to stop highlighting myself so we can listen to Dr. Marika Warren share a little bit more about her reflections of what Dr. Jeffers said, and then we're going to slowly be opening it up to you all.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much, Chike, for your comments. I come to you today from Chiboktuk, and my goal here is sort of both give you a sense of the ways that ethics support is integrated within Nova Scotia Health, IWK, as well as with DHW, but also to just connect some of the sorts of things that come up for us in doing that sort of consult and support work to what we've been given by Dr. Jeffers here around that important role of Ubuntu and the orientation of the community or the whole, and thinking of those as stakeholders and ethics consults as well. So in terms of the sort of supports that are available, so there's the sort of traditional clinical ethics consultation, which you might be familiar with, you've been involved with, often involving a particular patient where there's a question about how care should be provided for this individual. It can come from the healthcare team, it can come from the patient themselves, it can come from families as well, and there are tools that have been designed to support patients and families available both through Nova Scotia Health and IWK in order to help with that sort of work. And then there's also support available for organizational ethics consults. So the sort of broader system-oriented questions that come up around how do we allocate resources, how do we prioritize for folks who need to access supports and services and things like that. And there's also a framework that's been developed there that focuses on equitable distribution of resources, and where that question of who is affected by this is, again, not just on an individual basis, but really takes into account which communities are affected, and asks about how are they affected, and is this the same community or group that has been negatively affected by a long history of those sorts of decisions. So, and again, across a number of axes, including race, indigeneity, geography, so rural, smaller centers, things like that, as well as age, size, LGBTQ2S+ status. So the full range of who's being affected, but thinking beyond the individual. So in terms of some of the things that come up for consult, often it's generally, if there are straightforward ethical questions, healthcare providers are well trained and able to address those in practice and sort of feel comfortable with where those land. And so I would argue that actually a lot of the consults that we get that are complex are ones where that sort of individual focus doesn't give us a sort of satisfying response, and that it's where there are effects on communities, or where our relationships with others are really central to, and our obligations to each other in the context of those relationships that come up and ask, like, is it just about this person's right, or is it more about the obligations that we have to community to be able to not just fix the immediate presenting complaint, but address the fact that this particular individual or members of a particular group keep on presenting in, for example, an emergency department context, and are looking for supports that we don't seem to be able to provide. So again, it's those sort of broader questions that I would argue are actually engaging notions like Ubuntu, or in Mi'kmaq, and Nogama, so the idea of all our relations, similar ideas of connection to that sort of broader community, or from a feminist perspective of relational ethics. So there's a number of things that come in. So when a lot of healthcare providers have been educated, they got the sort of standard 4 principles of biomedical ethics, so of respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And again, those tend to be fairly individually focused in their interpretation. And again, I would argue first that, yeah, when I do presentations, I'll often add relation onto the end of that list as the sort of, something that needs to be at the fore in considering, what our ethical obligations are in this particular case. But then in the process of consultation, it's about also taking that seriously, not just sort of, saying, okay, yes, and also, community, but really thinking about what does it mean to give weight as we're trying to balance all of the values. So, again, attending to those relationships doesn't negate the individual interest. So that two-headed crocodile image, as Anne mentioned, is really evocative, and I think really sums things up nicely in terms of what we're often trying to do. And so, in doing clinical ethics work, we tend to sort of go with whatever works in the particular situation. So, we aren't committed to necessarily a particular ethical theory. Sort of never have I gone into an ethics consult and been like, all right, so Kant, here's what he's got for us on this. But it's really what is appropriate to the situation. And so again, sort of flagging those places where relationships really matter. And again, taking that on board and balancing it is part of the work that we do. And there are tools and frameworks to help support this that, ask questions like essentially, who matters here? And again, thinking broadly about who, and then what matters to them and why. And then thinking about what are the options available to us, and then trying to do the balancing of all those in the process of discussion and collaboration to come to recommendations, which at the end of the day, it might be that it's still not a great answer. Often, if ethics is called in, I'll say, we're trying to find the least bad option that's available to us, because if there is a good option, people are fairly good at recognizing that and going with it. But those processes help us to ask questions to try and surface again what matters to people, and again recognizing that it's not just about often their rights, but often includes their familial relationships, community relationships, for some folks, relationships with non-human world as well. And again, really bringing those into the discussion seriously in that sort of facilitated discussion. So I think I'm going to leave it there in terms of trying to sort of find, here's how we approach this and how we've got some of the links to what Dr. Jeffers has given us. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffers. I put you here so that you can begin to perhaps share a little bit of your thoughts or reaction about what Dr. Warren said, and really reflecting on our current ethics consultation processes, and in what ways can an African-centered ethical paradigm expand our way of thinking. And I have 80 million questions, and I've already started receiving a couple through the chat. Please feel free, y'all, to add more in there, because we want to expand to you all.
Yeah, I think that what I'll say for now is that I thought the connections that were drawn so far were important ones. I think that there can be lots of challenges in how one understands what communal relationships are at stake when trying to think from the perspective, because on the one hand, you might say that there is a way to sort of simplify the point that has been made into something that you can just ask yourself, a very simple, seemingly simple questions that you can ask yourself, right, when thinking about an ethical question or an ethical dilemma, or a circumstance where you have to ask what is the ethical thing to do, right? So a way to put it would be that you ask yourself, which of the options will allow me to experience my relationship to others and fulfill my role as a community member, right? Or something like that, right? You know, how will each of the options allow me to be a better community member, right? So that's a way that you could sort of like boil it down to a thing that you just ask yourself, right? But then, you know, some of the, well, one complexity that I think is maybe worth recognizing is that one can be a member of multiple communities at the same time. And it's rather important that one is able to recognize that and recognize how one's various communal relationships might relate to each other, right? One question, if you support, you know, if you have the aim of supporting, for example, the indigenous peoples of our land, and you want to be in, and you want to think of yourself as part of a community that is Canada, and you want to think of them as part of your community, right? That might be one way that you would make sense of, you know, your aim to be a good community member, right? Being in some ways supportive of indigenous communities, right? But of course, part of the complexity of the situation is that being a good community member where the community is Canada can sometimes involve recognizing where it's important that you're outside the community. It's important that that community, right, deserves greater autonomy in ways that might for example, mean that there's some things that they are due, right, that you're not due. And that, of course, when it comes to relationship between, you know, so-called settler and indigenous folks, right? What does it mean for there to be things that are due to others but not due to you? And how do you see yourself as in community? You know, you can think of controversies over fishing and various situations where people are having trouble thinking about these nested communities and how they fit together. So yeah, my aim has been to say that there's a way to think of it as simple, but also to remember that there are great complexities in terms of putting this into action.
Thank you so much. There's so many directions we could go based upon those comments. And I do want to go into those larger conceptual components, but we have a question here that is actually more focused on a specific, which of course, ethical decision-making can be really helpfully visualized when we look at the application. So there was a question that was shared. Can an example be shared to help further our perspective, such as the issue noted regarding certain groups of people continuing to disproportionately be interfacing with emergency services at hospitals? So certain groups of people are disproportionately interacting with emergency services at hospitals. Can we think of, perhaps both of you would like to think about ethical decision-making? I'm going to maybe go to Dr. Marika first, give Dr. Jeffers a chance to have a drink of water and reflect, and then we'll come back.
So yeah, I think there's a number of groups who are traditionally vulnerable in our society who interface often at the ED, but one population that I imagine folks in social work would be particularly likely to play a role in care is folks who are unhoused or have unstable housing situations. And so the concern is that they're presenting to the emergency department not for a sort of clinical reason, but because of all the challenges that go along with instability in housing. And so some of the concern or frustration that sometimes comes up and is often framed as a sort of moral distress is that we're not able to do anything to meet sort of deeper underlying needs. We're responding to sort of a superficial or a Band-Aid type way, as opposed to ways that would mean that this person doesn't continue to use this as sort of a form of rescue. And they're incredibly difficult challenges that come up not just here in Nova Scotia, but elsewhere as well. And I think we're familiar with, for example, I believe it was in Winnipeg Emergency Department a few years back, where there was an Indigenous man who died in the emergency department, that really highlighted some of the systemic racism and the ways that that was played out in those contexts. And so, again, in terms of thinking about what are the obligations, to that sort of relationship to recognizing the broader obligation that we have as a healthcare system, I think that's often where we find it challenging, in that we sort of come up against other aspects of social and community services. And again, I feel like social workers are often at that interface, and where the challenge is the sense that there aren't adequate resources anywhere. And so that in not being able to get the resources that are needed, that there's a sort of failing in the relationship there, and that gives rise to a lot of moral distress. So I don't have a good answer, unfortunately. I wish I did very much when I get these sorts of consults, but hopefully that sort of frames out for you in ways that are, I imagine, very familiar, sort of the source of the ethical distress in these sorts of scenarios.
So I think that actually the definition of an ethical decision is when there isn't a clear answer. So that speaks to it perfectly. Dr. Jeffers, any reflections on that? Another question has come up, but I want to first focus on this.
So I'm a little unsure what to add.
That's okay. We can.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think that the question that was posed in the chat builds off of it. So perhaps you can do it. It's the question is similar to emergency health services, but is focused on policing. Are there any approaches or ethical considerations already out in the world on calling police or putting BIPOC folks in conflict with the law? Sometimes we are required to call, but I'm also possibly putting someone into the path of overt racism and harm, so I feel an ethical dilemma.
And that is one of the, again, the ethical dilemma are situations where there are two mutually exclusive courses of action, neither of which is sort of obviously right here. And so in terms of the sort of guidance being out there, not that I know of, that gives you something to sort of lean back on and feel like, phew, I've addressed my ethical obligations here by following this sort of thing. It is but I would argue actually the building of relationships across social services, being able to build, in some cases, positive relationships with law enforcement in ways that help to mitigate the harms that often are encountered, particularly by BIPOC folks when they are in the criminal justice system in various ways. That's sort of, again, it's not going to be entirely satisfying, but it's a sort of harm reduction approach to the sort of situation, so that you don't have to risk your professional licensure by not doing something where there's a requirement, but also that you're still alive to and attentive and responsive to the potential harms for the individual in the situation. And there's, again, I think we can probably all think of in healthcare, a lot of different scenarios that have a similar sort of situation. If we think, in child protection and the obligation to call there as well, that similar questions can sometimes come up around, I have this obligation, but it may lead ultimately to a worse situation at the end of the day. So how do we try and address that? So again, no easy answers. Again, if there are, people know and take them. So when you need that ethics support, it's not a sign of failing as a healthcare provider, as a social worker, but as, again, being appropriately sensitive to these really hard, challenging questions. And as Chike mentioned, that there aren't clear directions necessarily that come out of recognizing that we are deeply in relationship with each other in really complex ways, that you need to acknowledge that, but it doesn't necessarily provide guidance that needs to be taken on board into a really complex mix. And that part of it too is that there are going to be other constraints in the situation that are beyond your control. And so it's what can I control? Where do I have influence in this immediate situation? And then of course that advocacy piece, which is so much a part of social work, to get at those systemic and structural aspects that are at the root of these sorts of scenarios.
Thank you. Dr. Jeffers, any additional thoughts around this?
Yes, sure. I think that when one has had the thought, I'm worried about making this call because I'm concerned about how I'm exposing this person who comes from this community, right, to danger. If one has had that thought, I think it's important to recognize that one has, I think, already put into practice in an important way the principle that we're talking about today, right? That one has thought about how one can be in mutually beneficial communal relations with not only that individual, but in a broader social sense, right? You've already at that point shown the orientation towards a beneficial communal relation through attentiveness to the inequities, through attentiveness to the vulnerabilities at stake in the case. Now, unfortunately, yes, it does come back to the point that that Marika was making and that we've been making again and again. It doesn't make the decision easy, right? And one very important thought is that if one is considering whether to get law enforcement involved, and part of the reason is because of the possibility that the person is going to be harming others, right? Then depending on the situation, right, failing to intervene in the appropriate way, right, your concern to not make this person vulnerable, right, has now made someone else vulnerable. And so the question, of your communal relation has sort of rearisen and suggested that the idea of trying to protect that person by not getting law enforcement involved has meant that you've exposed another person to harm, right? So these are some of the difficult things that one is going to face, but and why there are no easy answers. But I do think that that it is meaningful, right, to try and keep that sense of communal relation in mind. As I said, I think that you've already shown that you've taken a step in the right direction by having the thoughts here.
So I appreciate both of you. One of the things that I hear is the ways in which identifying an ethical concern is in itself a form of Ubuntu, is in itself a form of recognizing relationality, the recognition that the only option is going to be trying to look at harm reduction is basically what I'm hearing. And that harm reduction is in itself an acceptance of the larger systemic framework and limitations. And it's about what is the best situation there. So this may be a good final question for us to be thinking about. First of all, I love the idea, and Marika, I heard you say it, this notion, both of you said it, this notion of celebrating that decision that there's an ethical dilemma, that awareness that there is an ethical dilemma. What that means is that we're not having the unconscious be making our decisions, and unconscious biases everywhere in a racist colonial system. So we're starting to become more aware, but now the question is, what do we do with that gut feeling in our stomach? Now, our ethical decision, I think we probably should do a whole ethics cafe on how do we know that we have an ethical concern. For me, it's that gut feeling, or I can't stop thinking about it, or it wakes me up in the middle of the night. Those are those moments where I'm like, there's got to be another option. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But what role does advocacy play once we identify the ethical concern? Because if all we can do is be aware and choose a harm reduction approach, the lesser of two evils, that can still leave us with moral distress. And my concern on behalf of our members who often experience ethical concerns, and PS, we have ethics decision-making consultation tools. Contact us when you have concerns. How do we build in advocacy to change the system? And Dr. Jeffers, you started with a brief comment that I almost want to invite you back to say more about on truth and reconciliation, and whether that's actually connected to justice, or what does justice look like. So what are your thoughts around the role of advocacy? I don't know who wants to go first. I don't want to be.
I'm happy to take a first stab, and then Chike can bring it home.
Jeffers.
But yeah, I think the role of advocacy is critical as that sort of second step. So I think the first is sort of accepting that, limitations of the situation, that you're doing your best to be a good community member, to be to honor the relationship that you have, as a professional, but also, again, we have a host of identities that are going to be salient to us in the situation, no matter who we are. But again, like you say, that leaving it there then leaves you with that sense of moral distress that I haven't done anything to address the underlying and systemic issues. And so the advocacy is key there. And in looking at the moral distress literature, that's something that's demonstrated to address moral distress is advocacy, as well as peer support. So the other piece is sort of knowing that you aren't the only one seeing this dynamic. So there's a sort of validation there that's also important. So there's a sort of awareness, acknowledgement, validation, and action, sort of, as I spill my tea, talking with my hands, that are all an important part of the process of addressing an ethics issue. So again, it doesn't stop sort of when the immediate situation has been resolved, but that there is certainly more in order to feel that you've really fulfilled the ethical obligations that you've recognized that you have.
Yes, I would add that, if we take the example that we were using before, and my comment that, simply by recognizing the vulnerabilities in the situation, that one has shown a desire to be in proper and beneficial communal relation. I mean, if I'm right that that's directly implied, I mean, it's important that the direct implication of that in turn is precisely that harm reduction is not all there is to it, is precisely that advocacy for social change has to be part of one's outlook and activity, right? Because it can't be that one has gotten a sense of the need to be in communal relationship and understood that, you know, that there are certain inequities that mean that the people who are supposed to protect us are often a danger to us, right? It can't be that one has come to understand that and the situation is to be left as is, right? So it simply has to be that one is committed, you know, at least implicitly, at least as a matter of logical consistency, right? One is committed to activism toward broader social change, right? Now, what that means in terms of how one apportions one's time and what causes you give what energies to, and right, there's of course still no easy answers at that point, right? But I do think that it's a very direct implication that one has to be moving in that direction as one moves through life.
Thank you both so much for sharing of your wisdom and your time and your expertise in helping us begin to make more conscious some of the ethical concerns that we all struggle with, either at a conscious level or at an unconscious level. It occurred to me as I was listening to you both that part of an ethics consultation process is about making the concern of one person conscious for many people. And when we developed our ethics consultation process, which we just developed in the past year, we consulted with everyone across. We consulted with multiple countries and jurisdictions on ethical consultation processes, and there wasn't as much of a tie-in around advocacy as we felt should be there. So first of all, I'm super proud and excited of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers for its emphasis on advocacy, and please mark your calendars for March 24th, our Advocacy Day. It's going to be our second annual Advocacy Day, and hopefully it's going to be the start of a major transformation around putting advocacy first. Dr. Marika Warren just said, as the quote on the door of my office says, "Action is the sole medium of expression for ethics." And so as we close this lunch and learn, I'm going to ask both Dr. Warren and Dr. Jeffers if there are any final brief parting thoughts that they want to leave us with. I want to just remind us to reflect on the ways in which what we think of as ethics and the decisions, the reflections, the conscious ways we think about it are currently manufactured by colonial academic institutions of Euro-Western background that do not necessarily reflect the full scope of global ethics that we ought to be reflecting on. So I'm grateful to Dr. Jeffers for sharing and highlighting some of the ways and teachings of African-centered ethics. And I know for me, the crocodile, the two heads with one stomach fighting, is a beautiful visual that I will keep with me. I'm going to just ask you both, if you don't mind, any last thoughts before we send everyone off on their day.
I think the only last thing that's sort of on my thoughts to share is one, just how we're starting to shift our thinking, even in sort of traditional ethics, to reflect again some of the insights of non-Western philosophies, and sort of acknowledging, for example, interdependence in decision making, and the role of supported decision making. And so I think there are shifts and changes within how we operate in healthcare that are starting to not just sort of acknowledge or recognize, but really embed some of the insights about, again, the deeper importance of the relationship that we have to our sense of who we are as human beings. So that's the only other thing I wanted to flag, and just to say thank you all the participants, thank you Anne for organizing, and thank you Chike for a really stimulating and fabulous discussion.
Thank you so much, and thank you for what you do to ensure that our healthcare decisions start to incorporate principles and values that are non-European and non-colonial, so that we can slowly evolve to a better world. Dr. Jeffers, any final reflections?
I would reflect on saying that the fact that me coming from the discipline of philosophy and coming to talk with the social work folks is a communal relationship that I make it as actually somewhat serious point, right? Because when we bring together knowledge and insight from various fields, right, then we're showing a desire to be a growing community in which we're each playing a role and helping each other grow. So I'm happy for that aspect.
Thank you so very much for doing that, and for pointing out that the division of knowledge into disciplines is part of the divide and conquer strategy that has maintained capitalism, neoliberalism, colonialism, racism, slavery, and all of the other isms. And so grateful to both of you from different disciplines for sharing your wisdom with us social workers, so that we can work to do what Dominic just put in the chat. One small step can make a big difference. So gratitude to everyone attending, both live and also those who are watching this through our YouTube channel later, for all that you do to elevate ethical concerns, recognize their importance, and help us transform ethical concerns into advocacy for a better world. With abundant gratitude to all of you, may you be safe in our snowy day. And thank you again so much, Dr. Jeffers, Dr. Warren. Grateful to everyone.